I mean, anybody who's got experience with mainstream queer film festivals, I think you probably notice, if you look carefully, that a lot of the content is really very similar, and it comes from cisgender male perspective. It's very male-centric for the most part, and that's something that we decided we didn't really want to do.
Hi, my name is Ana Michelle Morejon. I'm a digital inclusion outreach coordinator here at MetroEast Community Media, and this is Producer's Corner, where we spotlight diverse voices and content creators in East Multnomah County and beyond. And today on the podcast with me, I have Juan Antonio Trujillo, who's a queer Latino filmmaker, festival director of TAG, a queer shorts film festival, which I was lucky to attend back in April of 2024. I loved my experience. We connected there, and I knew we had to have him on the show, especially as we're recording approaching Pride Month. So hoping we can time this as an awesome release to just spotlight the work of queer content creators in our community. Juan also is a director at Inverso Productions, and I'm excited to hear more about you. Thanks for being on the show. If you could just tell me a little bit more about yourself and your background, what brought you here today?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be on. And it's nice to hear that you are coming from an education coordinator perspective, because education is really pretty much where I'm based also. I think that it has a lot to do with how the festival operates, and it certainly has a lot to do with what I bring to the picture. I actually come from a long line of educators. I don't know, there might be something sort of genetic about it. My mom's dad was an educator. His two brothers were educators. My dad was an educator. He had at least one brother who was an educator. And it almost feels like that's what was going to happen. At any rate, I was born and raised in Tacoma, Washington. Part of what was at that point a very, very small Latino community. Certainly things have changed since then for the better when it comes to that sort of thing. Certainly a lot more diversity, a lot more access to cultural sorts of things that we just really didn't have back then. I left pretty young. I finished high school, and 2 weeks later, at age 17, I headed off to Brigham Young University in Provo. I was raised Mormon, and of course, we're talking about a queer film festival, so it's probably clear from that there was a bit of a shift in my own perspectives and values somewhere along the way. I went to graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin, and I suppose that's maybe where I started to get a little bit radicalized and started to explore some ways of thinking and being outside of this religion-dominated environment that I had been studying in before. I graduated in '97 from the University of Texas and came here to work in Oregon. Something I was very excited to be able to do. It was close to family, just a couple hour drive to Tacoma.
Yeah. What brought you to Oregon and to Portland specifically?
Well, I was fortunate to get a job here. In academia, you really don't get a lot of say in where you end up. We end up hyper-specialized coming out of a graduate program, and you end up being part of a community of maybe 10, 15 people who do exactly what you do all over the country. And if one of those people retires, moves on, that's where the openings are. And so I really considered myself really fortunate to find a position so close to where I grew up and where I could have the support of family nearby or close enough without being too close. So that's why I ended up here at Oregon State University, where I kept working until COVID hit. There was a retirement incentive that came along, and I decided to jump at that. I had already been living part-time in Portland, spending part of the week here, and decided to make it a permanent transition. And the festival came with me.
And so you taught linguistics, right?
Correct.
And so how did you go from linguistics to film and the film festival? What was the journey there?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Well, my interest in education, I think, well, I said I was radicalized a bit at the University of Texas, and I certainly became even more so as I started teaching on my own. My teaching philosophy is very heavily influenced by folks like Bell Hooks, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire, And those are approaches to education. They're very community-centered, very hands-on. And so as soon as I had my own opportunity to develop activities in a classroom, I tried to do things that were not just book oriented, or that didn't involve people just sitting and reading papers and taking tests. So film very quickly became part of what happened in the classroom with me. That said, I didn't know anything about film. I was asking my students to do short films on different topics because it got them into the community. It got them in touch with actual people and got to hear stories that they weren't going to hear if they stuck to traditional academic sources. And then I started thinking about this. It's like, well, how can I keep asking these people to keep making films when I don't know anything really about it myself? So I took a workshop with Northwest Documentary, and it was something that just really felt good. It let me incorporate not just my academic background, but it let me kind of continue to play with photography and imagery, which is something that I had always had an interest in. It forces you to write better than you've ever written before. It forces you to edit more than you've ever edited before. It was a fantastic career move. And so that's something that just kind of moved me over into film increasingly as my time started to wind down at OSU. I was really working much, much less with linguistics and a lot more with more interdisciplinary work that let me incorporate media in a really significant way.
That's so cool that you were able to have your students do projects like that, because I think of, and thinking also of TAG, film it's an art form, but it's also a way to encourage dialogue and activism. And it's a process for the filmmaker who's interviewing people, but also the interviewers to share their story, or the interviewees to share their stories. So the way that was able to then transition into you learning about film and then to the festival, like it's not the usual story, I think. And so I'd love to hear more about the festival and how that began.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great connection here because really the festival started as an academic project. There was a colleague at OSU who decided that this would be a really cool thing to do. Let's set up a festival, and students will take a class, and during the class, they will be able to view films, make selections, have conversations about what should or shouldn't be put on the screen. And unfortunately, the class part never happened. It ended up being exclusively a discussion that happened with faculty. We had the support of the OSU administration, in particular the library was able to help us out with the parts that were really quite expensive. In the earliest years of the festival, the first edition of the festival was in 2013. It was all feature-length films, and it was all selected just by a curation process. There weren't any submissions. And really, whatever it is that seemed appealing, that the library could get performance rights to, along with a physical copy to keep in the library, that's what we showed. And then things just sort of evolved. It started, like I said, as an academic exercise that really never got entirely off the ground. I came in as the lead director in the third season of the festival. And that's when we started looking at having submissions and started really doing some thinking about what kinds of voices were being included and excluded. And so really what TAG has turned into is a very niche festival. What we're talking about is a festival that certainly has content from across the spectrum of creators, but deliberately tries very, very hard to emphasize the voices of people of color and people who come from other marginalized segments of the queer population. Anybody who's got experience with mainstream queer film festivals, I think you probably notice, if you look carefully, that a lot of the content is really very similar, and it comes from a cisgender male perspective. It's very male-centric for the most part. And that's something that we decided we didn't really want to do. And one of the biggest shifts that happened in the early days of the festival is the requirement that all of our content be made by queer or trans identifying directors or producers. And this came about because there was an individual who submitted a feature-length film that was very well received. It's not that it was a bad film, but we used to have some sort of social events after the screenings. And so a group of us went with the director of this film, who was reasonably local. I won't name the person. And this was a male director. And we learned in the course of our dinner with this person that they did not identify as queer. They did not identify with the religion that they were depicting in their feature film. And they proceeded to hit on one of our female graduate student assistants. And so there were conversations after that. And it was like, straight people have been given plenty of opportunity to share their stories. They don't need to have the opportunity to share our stories. So let's make a rule. And from that point on, we required everybody who submitted work to our festival to identify openly as queer or trans.
Yeah, I love that mentality because representation on screen is important, but it's equally important off screen. And then if you're creating these community spaces too, that community is intentional. If you're comfortable, I'm very interested to hear about your own identities, maybe intersectionality between queerness, being Latino, and how you've brought that into the festival and into your own work.
Wow, that's a difficult question because it would be easy for me. I think a lot of people in my position would say, "Hey, I'm Latino, I'm diverse, therefore I've got that base covered, and I can just do my thing." And by definition, whatever kind of perspective it is that I'm bringing to it, it's diverse and it's good, and we've got the job done. That box is checked. That's not really how I feel. I mean, I have to acknowledge that I am a light-skinned person. I am a white-passing Latino individual. And I know that my experience does not match that of many people, even in my own family, who happen to have a different appearance than I do. I acknowledge also that I'm a cisgender male, pronouns he, him, and even though I'm gay and I have relationships and fall in love with other men, that's not really the definition of diverse either, is it? And so what I have had to do is acknowledge my perspective and the fact that I have some consciousness about this, but really leverage that to look very carefully at what's coming in and make sure that I don't stop with identities that are like mine, and to push it even further and to step back even more to make sure that there is space for people whose intersectional experience is different from mine, to have their stories presented as part of our work as well.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear that you're going the extra step. And I relate to that as a white passing. I'm also Latina, I'm Cuban. And so a lot of the stuff that you said resonates with me. Before we started recording, you mentioned a little bit about the accessibility piece of the podcast, of the film festival and requiring captions. Could you share a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we're just really at the beginning of the journey with TAG when it comes to accessibility. As we've looked into it, there's so many aspects to accessibility in filmmaking that need to be looked at. But one of the, I guess, bits of low-hanging fruit is making sure that we have films shown in our screenings that are accessible to people who need text support. And that's not just exclusively for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. There are plenty of other people, for example, folks who have a different linguistic background can certainly benefit many times from having the written text on the screen. Their knowledge of English might be okay, but having it on there really just kind of gives them that extra bit of access. So yeah, what we do as a baseline, every single film that comes into TAG the filmmakers are required to check a box saying that they have captions available in at least English and, if possible, in other languages as well. The venue that we've been using right now really only allows us to display one language at a time, but they do have the capacity, if we were to continue working with them, to have those. There are these little tiny LED screens that have a kind of a gooseneck thing. You stick them in the cup holder, and they display for the individual the captions in whatever language we decide to send to it. They all have like little different channel selectors.
Wait, what is that? I've never heard of it. So it would be like in my seat, I could have an individual screen?
Yes, you could have yeah.
What?
And it's a little narrow thing, so it doesn't block the view of other people
Yeah.
behind you.
Have you ever been to a screening where that was implemented?
I've seen them tested. We worked with the folks at the Hollywood Theater where we show our festival, and they
Wow.
demonstrated it to me. But we decided to go with open captions for this particular.
Yeah, I've never heard of something like that. So that's something that I'd be interested in seeing a future where something like that is implemented on a wider scale, not just for film festivals, but for movies, because of that accessibility piece. Even linguistically, I mean, that's a great point too. I kind of want to pivot into maybe your own personal work and what sorts of projects are you working on? Actually, no, I take that back. Before we do that, is there anything I know you brought your program with you. I'd like to talk about maybe like specific films that you felt like were really groundbreaking, things you were excited by. It can be from this festival, it can be from a previous festival. Yeah. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I could certainly do that. One of the things I was sort of thinking about as I was planning for this was, should the question come up, what sorts of advice would you give to people who were planning on submitting something to a film festival like the one that we drew? And I think that the questions can kind of be combined a little bit. First of all, what I think. And again, this is partly about the philosophy of the festival. One of the things that's important to us, and one of the reasons that we do shorts, is that they're accessible. There are certainly short films that cost tens of thousands of dollars to make, no doubt. That said, we have also had lots of films submitted that were done with very little equipment. Is it possible to just do it on a phone and submit it? Absolutely. It can be done. And so I think that what we have tried to do when it comes to the selection of films is not look for something that looks like it's got blockbuster potential. We are looking for some kind of story that is new and fresh and relates to experiences that are not frequently seen on the screen. And so when you ask me, what are some really great films that we've seen, it's hard for me to come up with a really specific idea of a specific film. In general, the ones that impress me are the ones that have a lot of humanity to them, a lot of heart, and that come from a really honest, often unheard perspective. And this isn't something that the rest of the directors necessarily enjoy. We had someone who was complaining to me quietly after the screening this year. And they said, we've got all these international films, and they're just so full of trauma and horrific sorts of things happening. And it's like, we already did that here. We got past all of that kind of film 20 years ago. I don't want to have to see it all again. And that is exactly the opposite of the way we look at things. If there are people who are experiencing life that way now, we want them to have the opportunity to tell those stories. And I think that one of the things that can be helpful is to find some sort of community that helps you pull those sorts of things together. So when I think of specific films that have had an impact, it's not that this is a great film, but there is a filmmaker who submitted one of our pretty early seasons, a film that I know would be pretty scandalous. In fact, we couldn't show it at our current venue because they have some restrictions on content. It is a very simple short film. If I recall, it's maybe 3-4 minutes long at most. And it is two trans people having sex. And it is not simulated. It's just full on two trans people having sex. And the thing is, you look at that, it's like, is this just, is this here just for titillation? Are they just trying to be provocative and lurid? And it's just like, this is a very central part of their life that has been turned into, even since then, legally, this whole quagmire. Why shouldn't there be some opportunity for this to be shown, to be normalized? And I say this because one of the actors in that particular film is someone who has, in fact, since that year, because we started building that relationship with that person, has submitted probably 3 or 4 films, not of their own making, but people who they believe have a story to tell. And they have just kind of taken it upon themselves to help guide them through the process of getting films submitted and included in festivals. And it's been some of my favorite work has come from this one single individual. And it's, I'd love to see more of that sort of thing happening. These kind of little creative clusters developing around the world in different places.
There's something so beautiful and empowering and uplifting about submitting to film festivals like this, where you're like in your niche and around community that that issue is really going to be seen and carried forward. I mentioned in my intro, but I went to the film festival in April. The section was, I think it was called Acting Out, Acting Up.
Mm-hmm, yeah, right.
Yeah. And it was there was a diversity of content too. There were some international pieces that had some of those heavy topics of discrimination, of homophobia, transphobia in those countries, which is still ongoing, even though we like to hear, I love stories of queer joy, but there's queer pain and queer grief, and that is still ongoing, even if it's hard to hear. Now I'll bring it to my question of your own personal projects. What type of stuff have you worked on? Do you aspire to work on? I'd love to hear more just about you.
Yeah, sure. Well, and that kind of goes back to the other thing you mentioned, that I have also this other side business, Inverso Productions. And so everything that I have released as short films, it all kind of goes through that particular arm and not through the festival. So the workshop that I took with Northwest Documentary that kind of got the ball rolling on so much of this, the topic that I chose for that particular workshop was my own experience as a Mormon missionary who had a relationship that became moderately sexual with another Mormon missionary. And if anyone here knows about the church, that's not okay. And, to this day, I look back and it's like, I don't know exactly how it is that I was not sent home in shame. I think that there are some ways that that folks in positions of power in the mission structure were able to say, well, this happened, but this didn't happen. So it wasn't really sex. And so it's okay. You can stay. But for whatever reason, yeah. So my first film was telling that story. And I learned a lot about vulnerability, and I learned a lot about the production side of things as well. And I think that I've continued to try to work on both in things that I've done since then. What I have been mostly doing recently are short essay pieces that continue to be very personal. They're usually, well, in fact, some of them are actually things that I wrote as poems to be read at a poetry reading, and I decided to combine the imagery because I think of, as a linguist, I think a lot of folks think of linguistics as being very specifically about written or spoken language, but it's really bigger than that. It's really more about systems of communication, and those exist. Human beings develop languages in so many different areas. So one of the last classes that I taught at OSU, one of my favorite ones, was food and ethnic identity. And it was really, for me, sort of a linguistics class. Is what is the language of cultural identity when it comes to food? Tamales means something different than borscht. But every culture has some way of building community, defining insiders and outsiders, transmitting messages about what's valued, what's not valued through food. And the same thing is true with film and imagery. Imagery is another language. And so what I've done with these poetry films is try to enhance what's being spoken with imagery.
And where do you distribute those films? Can anyone watch them? Are they online?
A couple of them online. The last one that I kind of the most involved poetry thing that I did recently was done specifically for the Insight poetry readings that are held at Literary Arts every other month. And I think they may have a link to that, and certainly people can contact me and I can provide a link to that. That was a 3-parter. It's about my Mormon upbringing, and it's got 3 poetic pieces. They have a theme for the Insight readings, and it was the month that I participated. It was called Catching Fire.
Oh, like Hunger Games Part 2. I don't know if you are aware of that that series.
I have seen most of those, yes, mostly while trapped on an airplane.
Yeah, I recently binge watched the whole thing. So, but there was something else on your El Inverso Productions website. It was, I wish I remembered the name, but it had something. It was like a queer stories archive.
Oh, yeah. Well, there are a couple things going on there. Yes. So there is, we have a collection of short interviews, kind of oral histories that can be accessed through El Inverso. And quite a bit more involved project called Mapping Masculinities. And I worked with a collaborator on that with a grant from the Regional Arts and Culture Council in Portland. It is a selection. We interviewed like 40 people, and the project isn't done yet because not everyone of those 40 interviews, they're not all edited yet. There's quite a stack, and we in fact have a follow-up grant to get more of those pieces put together. The longest ones are about a half an hour, but they're all explorations of masculinity from the perspective of queer men of color. Men broadly defined, because we certainly include the input from trans men as well.
Yeah, what is your intention for like how, maybe who should see it, or what's the goal for the archive?
The goal for that and our intention for who should see it is really kind of similar for the festival. The festival is not designed for straight people to, if they want to attend and learn about our lives, great. It's really there for us to spark conversation within the community, and that's what the Mapping Masculinities project is designed to do as well. Originally, because we were doing this before COVID hit, the plan was to roll out these segments in actual live events with opportunities for people to see a segment or two and then engage in conversation about the themes that emerge. And I think it would be great to be able to come back to that idea in some way. But it's really, that material is designed to be, it's information, thoughts about being male embodied and a person of color in order to have conversations with male embodied people of color about our masculinity,
Yeah, I'd love to see any conversation that stems out of that work, and I hope to attend the festival next year. Before I wrap up, is there any links, places that you'd like our viewers, listeners to learn more about you, the festival, and your work?
The best place is probably just to go to the festival's main website, tag QSF.
And I'll link it below.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you for being on the show with us, Juan. This was Producer's Corner, where we spotlight diverse voices and content creators in East Multnomah County and beyond. We're part of MetroEast Community Media, which is a nonprofit community media center located in Gresham, Oregon, where we teach the public how to make their own media. And every episode of this podcast is recorded by an educational cohort who gains hands-on production experience. If you haven't checked out our last episodes, I encourage you to do so. Maybe give us a like, a review, a comment, share it with a friend if you enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for joining. See ya.